All right, so we're going to start with the IAMFC Code of Ethics. So the International Association of Marriage and Family Counselors. I had to look that up again. Keep getting lost in all the acronyms. But yeah, I'm not going to go through I'm trying to keep these videos pretty brief, so I'll just go through cover a couple thoughts on the Code of Ethics and then the chapters from Gladding. But the first thing that I wanted to mention about the Code of Ethics was this idea of competence. So Section C addresses competence from the IAMFC Code of Ethics. And you might think, I don't feel competent to provide services to families or couples. Maybe one class isn't sufficient. But as it comes to licensure boards, most licensure boards are going to see your license. But every state's different. But as a licensed professional counselor or whatever iteration is in your state, they'll likely see you as competent. And my belief system is that I think you are, even if, and by the end you will be after internship and having more supervision to provide, services to couples and families. You might not feel that way, especially if you don't get a lot of training in that. But the core skills that you're learning and like from group, especially like you were seeing that system lens in group, you kind of get some of the skills that you need to be able to engage with the system, engage with multiple people in front of you. So you might have different reactions than that, and that's totally fine. You can read through Section C and kind of see how you interpret things. But, I think the difference is if there's a specific approach to working with a family, like that sure, you might need additional training to be able to and to be certified in a specific approach. But I guess the point I'm trying to make is you'll likely be able to do some good and help a family or a couple in front of you based on the skills that you're learning in the coursework throughout your program at ASU. So just a few thoughts there. So really quick, Section F, and specific the Code 12 and H1 as well, kind of addresses how the ACA Code of Ethics plays with the IAMFC Code of Ethics. So I kind of, ideally, and in most cases, these codes of ethics are going to just support each other, enhance the lens from which to view ethical scenarios. So once again, that's why it's important that we're looking at this specific code of ethics in addition to the ACA code of ethics from other coursework. But there's going to be some differences though. And sometimes you kind of have to reconcile that if you're running into an ethical dilemma of how do I work through this? And maybe a question is like, does one supersede the other? If one does, I would see it in my mind that the ACA code of ethics is the core code of ethics. Because IAMFC is like a branch underneath ACA. But once again, both should work together ultimately. But if there's differences and you're kind of navigating an ethical decision, it'd be, I would see the core code of ethics as the ACA code of ethics. But once again, you need to be understanding what your state requires, as well as your site, when you're navigating ethical dilemmas. So just a few thoughts there. All right, so let's jump over to the Gladding text. So chapter 1 is kind of going over the history of family therapy. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the nuances. Maybe just something to consider is that it might appear tedious that there's lots of different names being addressed, but, it's likely important for, the NCE or the CPCE or, the comprehensive exam that you're taking. So, a lot of times these names can kind of help for those exams, as well as just kind of help you keep straight, which names are connected with which theoretical approaches. So just some things to be considered there. But I think one core thing that I wanted to bring up from page 5 is Nathan Ackerman. So Nathan Ackerman was an early proponent of the family lens and the system lens approach to working with clients. And I think the key is here that in family counseling, let's say the family has 5 people who are part of the family. You don't have 5 different clients. The client is the family. So the family unit, so you have one client, that's the family. So I think that's like one thing to try to wrap your head around is like, okay, so I'm not seeing 5 different people and trying to help 5 different people come together. I'm trying to help one unit, one system that's in a relational dance, that's trying to cooperate and work together, that has its friction points, but that all occurs as part of the system. So it's like this living organism of the family is the client rather than just focusing on the parts of the family. So that'll I hope that throughout this course that makes a bit more sense and you kind of start to wrap your head around that now. But I think that's an important paradigm shift from day one that you need to start thinking about is like, how can I see, you know, the relationship between the members as the client, not the separate individuals necessarily. All right, so one thing to bring up really quick on page 7 is there's throughout the text there's family reflections, and these are often inviting you to reflect upon your family of origin and dynamics that are playing out, that have played out in your past and that are likely still there that are important for you to get awareness of. So once again, these family reflections are really important because if we don't go through our own work of reflecting upon our family of origin, issues and dynamics and patterns and traditions, we might unintentionally, subconsciously just kind of bring those into our work with individual clients as well as, family clients. So I think the example from double bind theory, as it talks about in the family reflection on page 7, is a good example. That double bind is when you're giving two contradictory messages, and they're given at the same time. So it kind of creates this sense of confusion. The receiver can be stressed and kind of there's ambiguity in what and how to respond to that messaging. So it invites you to kind of reflect on, when have you experienced the double bind, message from a family member or just in general. But I'd encourage you to think about, in your family, when has that occurred and what was that like for you? It starts to kind of get you to reflect on that. So I'd encourage you to keep reading those family reflection points and thinking deeply about, your inner experience and your experience in your family. I think one small example from my family of origin is that it's valued to talk openly, but if you start to bring up conflict, that's not valued. So it's almost like this double message. We want open communication, but only certain types of open communication. And that's never been spoken. It's just this underlying message that's, throughout time has been challenged more openly. That kind of underlying dynamic's been addressed, but that's, that double bind message of talk openly, but only in certain ways. So there's a catch to that. All right. So let's jump over to chapter 2. And I think the main things that I wanted to cover here are on circular causality. So at the start of the chapter, it's going to talk about, what is a family, what's family systems. So it has some important information there. But I think a good way to start to think about family counseling is, this distinguishing between linear causality and circular causality. So at the top of page 32 in the gliding text, and once again, I'm looking at the 7th edition. So I'll start with linear causality. So linear causality is basically like that something happens here, A, that's what occurs, and then that leads to B, this effect. So cause and effect relationship. So it might be that okay, this family member said blank, and then the second family member reacted like this, B. So this family member caused this reaction in the other. I imagine some of you are starting to be able to challenge that idea of linear causality. But so basically, overall, there's the idea in family counseling of circular causality, that A doesn't lead to B. A and B influence each other. So it's this continuous circle of, okay, so A says, curses at the other family member, and then the other one starts yelling back. So the yelling back then leads to more cursing, and the more cursing then leads to more yelling. So it's like this vicious cycle, this circle, of just almost like a downward spiral could be a better way of looking at it. But once again, so A and B are both playing off of each other. More of A leads to more of B, and more of B leads to more of A. So there's not really, it kind of challenges this idea of blame that A said something first, so that's the problem. But it's more just okay, the problem is this circle. And I think the same could go for a strengths-based look at that, so it could be, when A does something constructive and helpful, like maybe responds, in more of a gentle way, then B is more gentle, and so that could be a positive, circle seen there. But once again, that's one small insight into, okay, and I like, in figure 2.2, 2.3, it starts to give some examples of like how that might play out in a family system. But there's through the idea of feedback loops. So uh, let's see. I already used this language previously, but there's this idea of a relational dance, and I think that kind of plays into circular causality. That in family counseling, everyone's interacting with each other. So if one person changes, then that's going to impact everyone else. So just like a dance, like if you step on the foot, that's going to impact the other person, and then they're going to respond a different way, which impacts the other partner in the dance. Uh, so I guess one of the last things that I want to talk about is this idea of homeostasis. So homeostasis is basically where a system wants to keep the norm, the status quo. So if someone, I guess let's just use an example of a family. Like, so if the norm is to eat dinner at 6 o'clock and everyone's supposed to be there, they're going to want that to continue, especially if that's become like a long-standing norm. So that's the norm. So if someone's not there, that's going to be felt. So there might be conversations like, "Oh, well, why aren't you here? Like, we want you to be here at dinner." So basically, that's not the greatest example, but it's one idea of just like how a family system wants the norm to continue. So if anyone tries to go outside of the norm, a lot of times the other parts of the system want to pull that person back into the system to play the role that they've been playing. So that can go in positive and negative ways. Uh, so if someone has, struggles with addiction and that's become part of the norm and they're trying to like break that pattern, there could be certain people in the system that actually find value in them holding their addiction. That might kind of sound strange right now, but like there's this idea of deeply entrenched roles and traditions and norms that become the underlying framework of how the family functions. So if this person's no longer struggling with addiction, then other people in the system have to change and have to make sense of like, okay, how do I engage now in the family unit? Like maybe they like in more of an unconscious way, they like the person to be in the role of the person struggling with addiction because then they're the problem. Then they can be receiving the focus because maybe like let's just say parents are focusing on the addiction of a child and that's been the focus. But if the child loses they're no longer struggling with addiction, then maybe that means that there's been some underlying friction between the partners in the relationship. So then it's hard for them to be able to like, okay, so all of a sudden they can't focus on the child anymore. They're focused on each other, and that's a struggle. So just a few examples off the top of my head of just kind of how seeing a system, like it might be hard to see change in the system because it means that everyone's kind of reorganizing uh, in the unit. So the last thing that I'd like to bring up is on page 49. This has probably been addressed in other classes and probably just in your own thinking up to this point, but I want you to be considering of like, there's this idea of fit of like, okay, if I guess it addresses it at the top of page 49. So the fit between a family's and a therapist's life cycles plays a major role in the process of helping a family change. So it brings up that if there's, let's say in the family life cycle, the counselor is, 30 years of age and unmarried, but they're working with a family where the partners are 50 years old and they have children. There could be this idea of like, can the counselor help this family? They haven't gone through the similar experiences. They don't have any children, they're unmarried. Like, and the partners who are coming in for counseling are married with several children. So once again, there's no necessarily right answer to this that I'm not trying to say like, oh, yes, they can and no, they can't. I think it depends. It really depends on the counselor's ability to be able to enter the framework of the family client. But maybe it can help to have some similar experiences. Maybe it can actually hinder, to have some similar experiences as the family. Sometimes if we feel too much similarity with our clients, then it's like, oh, okay, so I've gone through something similar. I know. So if we don't keep checking ourselves to like really honor the uniqueness and the unique culture of the family in front of us, then we could kind of start to kind of get off. So I think those are just a few thoughts on the element of fit and matching the life cycle between family and therapist heading that I wanted to address there. So anyways, there's a little taste into the Gladding text. I won't cover everything. I'm not going to go through line by line. Obviously, you need to be doing some of the reading, but I'll kind of are reading the chapters, but I'll be emphasizing just a few thoughts and maybe trying to share a few pragmatic applications here and there of what it could look like. So anyways, thanks for viewing, and future videos will be a bit briefer because we won't be going through the welcome and the syllabus information. But yeah, if you have any questions on this or need to connect, please do.